You spend your career learning to read people, their tells, their pauses, the way their eyes shift when truth and lie wrestle for space. They trained me for that, taught me to catch every hesitation, every misplaced word, every nervous twitch. And for years I believed I could. My name is Richard Halverson, Captain, United States Army Intelligence Corps. The year was 1978, and the world was split in two, East and West. I was stationed in West Germany, right along the edge of the Iron Curtain. To the east, the Warsaw Pact, Moscow's reach, the shadow of the Kremlin. To the west, NATO, holding its breath, always waiting for the next move. Our mission wasn't to fire rifles or storm trenches. Ours was a quieter war, a war of whispers, shadows, and secrets. Sometimes those secrets came wrapped in blood, sometimes in ink, sometimes in the trembling voice of a man who wanted to trade one flag for another. That's how I met him, a defector, or so he claimed. A colonel from the East German Army. Said his conscience couldn't carry the burden anymore. Said he'd bring us names, plans, supply routes, if we could just get him and his family across the border. On paper, it looked like the kind of break men like me dream of. Intelligence that could shift the balance. Information that could save lives, maybe prevent another Prague Spring or Hungary. But war, even the quiet one, doesn't hand out gifts. Every miracle has strings. I should have known that. The first time I saw him was in a safe house, a crumbling apartment on the edge of Frankfurt. He was older than I expected. Late 50s, gray at the temples, face lined with the weight of too many choices. He carried himself like a soldier, though. Shoulders square, chin firm. Eyes that had seen too much and yet gave nothing away. He called himself Colonel Vogel. That wasn't his real name, of course, but it's the one that stuck in my memory. Vogel leaned forward at the table, his hands trembling just enough to seem human. "Captain Halverson," he said in careful English, "I bring you a gift. But gifts, they come with danger." He wasn't wrong. For weeks, Vogel fed us information. Convoys leaving Dresden, troop placements near Leipzig, a cache of SAM sites that could threaten our reconnaissance flights. And the thing was, it all checked out. Reports matched what our satellites saw. Other defectors confirmed fragments of his story. Piece by piece, he was building credibility. Piece by piece, he was building trust, and I believed him. God help me, I believed him. I vouched for him. I put my name, my reputation, my career on the line. He's real, I told my superiors. This man could change the game. They listened. Washington listened. So when Vogel told me he had something bigger, something that could tilt the Cold War on its axis, I didn't question it. Not enough anyway. He said he had the Soviet playbook for Western Europe. Detailed invasion plans. The kind of thing generals would kill to see. But to get it, he needed us to move first. He needed safe passage for his family, his wife, his daughter, his son. He said he'd bring the documents after they were safe. Looking back, it's almost laughable. The textbook setup for a double cross. But I didn't laugh then. I leaned in. I swallowed the hook. Because Vogel didn't just hand me secrets, he handed me conviction. His voice cracked at the right times. His stories lined up too neatly. He even showed me a photo of his daughter. Dark hair, shy smile, holding a violin. He was good, too good. And when a man mixes truth with lies, the poison is harder to taste. The night we set the operation in motion, I stood at the border, frost biting my fingers through thin gloves, eyes fixed on the horizon. I thought I was watching the beginning of history. I thought I was delivering salvation. What I didn't know was that I was opening the door to a nightmare, one that would cost lives, careers, and something far more fragile, trust. The night of the crossing still burns in my memory like frostbite that never heals. It was February 1978, the kind of cold that makes your bones feel brittle, the kind of night where the border guards on both sides stamped their boots and clutched their rifles tighter, just to keep the blood moving. We had chosen a sector outside of Fulda, remote, sparse patrols. We thought we had the timing worked out. We had studied their rotations, memorized the rhythm of their spotlights. We thought we knew the ground. Vogel arrived late, a half hour past the agreed time, shadows stretching long behind him. He was bundled in a heavy coat, collar turned high, and with him, just as he'd promised, his wife and 2 children. The wife clung to him like she was already halfway broken. The boy, maybe 12, carried himself stiff like he was pretending to be a soldier. The girl, the one from the photograph, she held a violin case close to her chest. That detail, God, it disarmed me. I remember thinking, even in the middle of the Cold War, a girl won't leave behind her music. That was the hook. The human detail that made it all feel real. We moved fast. My team, 3 men I trusted like brothers, hustled them toward the crossing. Our plan was simple: slip them through the fence, load them into a waiting vehicle, and vanish into the dark. And for a moment it worked. The cutters snipped the wire. The family crawled through one by one. The frost crunched beneath our boots. My breath clouded in front of me like smoke. But then came the sound. At first, just a ripple. A faint clatter of boots in the distance, then voices. German. Shouts cutting through the night. Spotlights swept the snow. Engines roared to life. They were waiting. It was a trap. And I had walked my men straight into it. Bullets cracked the air, splintering the fence posts. My men dove for cover, dragging the family with them. The boy screamed. The violin case tumbled into the snow, half open, revealing not strings, but wires, electronics, a transmitter. My stomach turned to stone. Vogel wasn't a defector, he was bait. The violin wasn't music, it was a beacon. I shouted for my team to fall back, but chaos had already swallowed the night. Muzzle flashes lit up the dark like fireflies from hell. My radio man, Lieutenant Harris, was hit in the leg. He went down screaming, blood soaking the snow. I dragged him back with one arm, firing blind with the other. My men laid down covering fire, but the East German guards kept pressing. It wasn't panic, it was precision. They knew we'd be there. They knew the exact time, the exact spot, and in the middle of it all, Vogel stood calm. Not afraid, not desperate. Calm. His eyes met mine through the chaos, and for the first time I saw the truth. Cold. Detached. A man who had sold me, sold us without ever blinking. We managed to break contact, barely. 2 of my men carried Harris, his screams muffled by gritted teeth. We abandoned the vehicle. Too obvious, too exposed. Instead, we slipped into the woods, branches whipping our faces, lungs burning with frost and fear. By the time we reached safety, Vogel and his family were gone. So were half our supplies. So was the faith my men had in me. Back at the safe house, the silence was worse than the gunfire. Harris lay on a table, pale, shaking, while the medic worked to stop the bleeding. Sergeant Colton, my second in command, stared at me like I was a stranger. "You vouched for him," he said. His voice was low, but each word was a hammer. "You swore he was real." I opened my mouth, but nothing came. Because he was right, I had been played. Not just fooled, dismantled. Every instinct I'd trusted, every skill I'd prided myself on, undone by one man and a well-placed lie. And the cost wasn't just blood on the snow, it was something deeper. The bond between soldier and commander. The trust that held us together. In that moment, I realized something no training manual ever taught. In the world of shadows, betrayal doesn't just come from the enemy. Sometimes it comes from yourself, from the part of you that wants to believe too badly. And I had believed. They say war wounds are carried on the body, but betrayal you carry in the silence. After Fulda, silence wrapped around me like a shroud. We made it back to base alive, barely. Harris lost his leg above the knee. Colton barely spoke to me. The others moved like ghosts, haunted by the knowledge that we'd been led like cattle into an ambush. And the worst part, no one blamed Vogel, no one cursed the East Germans. The anger was all pointed at me, and maybe they were right. Back at the compound, I filed the report, every detail, every bullet, every drop of blood. The paper trembled beneath my hands as I wrote, but I forced myself to keep going. That's the job of an officer, record the truth no matter how ugly. But in Washington, truth is currency, and sometimes currency gets manipulated. The response came within days. A summons. They wanted me in Langley. Not later, now. I traveled under orders, sat in the back of a black sedan, watched the winter landscape blur past. My reflection in the glass was older than I remembered. Lines deeper, eyes darker. The uniform felt heavier on my shoulder. At headquarters, they stripped the story down to bone. A conference room, bright lights, men in suits who had never felt mud sucking at their boots. They asked the same question over and over. How did you know Vogel was genuine? I told them. The photo of the girl, the details about troop placements, his desperation in the safe house. I laid it out like evidence, like a lawyer building a case. They didn't nod. They didn't frown. They just watched. Then one of them, a gray-haired analyst with hands too smooth to belong to a soldier, slid a file across the table. "Read this," he said. I opened it. Inside were transcripts, coded intercepts, dates, times, and in the middle of it all, one name repeated. Vogel, not as a defector, as an asset, their asset, fed to us by the Ministry for State Security, Stasi, a fabrication designed to test our channels, to see how far they could push, and we had taken the bait. My chest tightened. Every word on the page was a knife twisting deeper. Vogel hadn't just fooled me. He had fooled the entire machine, but the machine wasn't going to take the blame. They wanted a scapegoat, and I was sitting in the chair. For hours they pressed. Why hadn't I double-checked? Why hadn't I waited for further verification? Why had I pushed so hard for extraction? Each question was a bullet, and I had no armor left. When the interrogation ended, they didn't thank me. They didn't dismiss me. They simply said, "You'll be reassigned, effective immediately." Reassigned, that was their word. But the truth was clearer. I was finished. I returned to Germany a ghost in uniform. My command stripped, my men reassigned under different officers. Harris shipped home in silence, his sacrifice buried under classified reports. Colton avoided me like I was contagious. The work that had once defined me, the endless nights of watching, waiting, reporting, it was gone. My career had ended not with a medal, not with honor, but with a single name, Vogel. But here's the part they never understood. It wasn't the end for me, because betrayal doesn't stop at the border. It doesn't stay buried in a file. Betrayal festers, and a soldier who has nothing left to lose is more dangerous than one still playing by the rules. So I made myself a promise. If Vogel was still out there, and I knew he was, I'd find him. Not as an officer, not as a spy, as a man who'd been broken and left behind. And when I did, I'd make him understand that some debts aren't paid with money or politics or leverage. Some debts are paid in kind. When the army shuts its doors on you, it doesn't slam them loud, it just quietly closes them in your face. One day you're Captain Halverson, trusted, briefed, connected. The next you're a ghost on payroll. Desk work, no command, no voice. Just a shadow of the man you were. I should have walked away, taken my pension, buried myself in bourbon, and let the machine grind on without me. But I couldn't, because every time I closed my eyes, I saw Vogel's face, not in fear, not in desperation, but in triumph. A smirk buried beneath the performance, the kind of smirk you only recognize in hindsight, once the knife is already in your back. So I started digging, not officially, no memos, no chain of command, just me, my memory, and a few favors left uncollected. I reached out to old contacts, Germans, Poles, even a Czech smuggler I'd busted years earlier. Each owed me something, and I came to collect, not for the army, for myself. The answers came slow, piecemeal, like scraps tossed to a starving dog. But together they built a picture. Vogel wasn't dead, he wasn't forgotten. He was living well, very well. Word was the Stasi had rewarded him for the performance of a lifetime. A townhouse in East Berlin. Protection, privilege. He was still a ghost, but a ghost draped in velvet, and that made the fire in my gut burn hotter. I spent nights in bars where the air reeked of smoke and suspicion, days trailing men who spoke in half sentences and vanished when the light shifted. I wasn't an officer anymore. I wasn't even a soldier, I was a hunter. One night in a backroom tavern on the west side, I cornered a courier, young, nervous. He carried messages for men who made shadows their business. I laid my pistol on the table, its weight speaking louder than words. He broke fast. Fear is the oldest language. Vogel was still active, he said. Not just living, working, feeding disinformation back into Western channels, setting snares for men like me, and worse. Vogel had a new code name. He wasn't Vogel anymore, he was Orpheus. The name made my stomach turn. Orpheus, the one who charmed the underworld with his song, who nearly brought back the dead. Appropriate, I thought, for a man who lured us into hell with his lies. I left that bar with more than a name. I left with purpose, but obsession has a cost. My drinking worsened. My temper shortened. Friends stopped answering my calls. The army didn't discharge me, but they made sure I was invisible, forgotten. And maybe they were right to. Because the man I was becoming, the man I had to become, wasn't their kind of soldier anymore. Weeks turned into months, and still I followed the trail. East Berlin, Leipzig, Dresden. Each lead was another step into enemy territory. I crossed borders on forged papers, slept in cheap hotels with roaches for company. The uniform was gone. I dressed like a civilian now, but the mission was carved into my bones. And then, one night in Berlin, I saw him. It was late, near Alexanderplatz. The streets slick with rain, neon lights bleeding into puddles. I was walking back from a contact when a car door opened across the square. And there he was. Vogel, older, fuller in the face, dressed in a suit that screamed privilege, but unmistakably him. He didn't see me. He didn't even glance my way. He moved with the ease of a man who thought himself untouchable. I froze. My hand drifted to the pistol beneath my coat. For a heartbeat, the world narrowed to the same tunnel I'd felt through a rifle scope years before. One squeeze, one shot. Justice or revenge would be mine. But I didn't, because this wasn't about a single bullet anymore. Vogel had spun a web far larger than me, larger than my platoon, larger than Fulda. And if I killed him in a square in Berlin, he'd just become another ghost in another file. No, if I was going to bring Vogel down, it had to mean something, and so I let him walk. But as he disappeared into the rain, I made myself another promise. The next time I saw him, it wouldn't be chance, it would be the end. The image of Vogel walking away that night branded itself into my skull. His figure, blurred by rain and neon light, haunted me more than the ambush in Fulda ever had. Because this time I wasn't powerless. I had seen him, alive, protected, thriving, and I had chosen to let him walk. But choice is a heavy thing. It lingers, it gnaws. From that moment on, my life narrowed to a single purpose. To drag Vogel into the light, strip away his lies, and make him pay, not with a bullet, but with truth. I began to plan. The first step was information. I needed to know how a man like Vogel operated inside East Germany with such freedom. Protection of that kind didn't come cheap, not even from the Stasi. Someone had vouched for him. Someone had built his new identity, secured his privileges, covered his tracks. I leaned on contacts who still owed me scraps of loyalty. A black market printer in Frankfurt slipped me papers marked with Stasi insignia. A smuggler in Hamburg passed whispers about Orpheus and his patrons. Bit by bit, a picture formed. Vogel wasn't just a defector, he was a tool. A weapon wielded by men far higher up the chain. He fed the Stasi disinformation about NATO troop movements. He spun stories that sowed doubt among Western allies. And worse, he lured in new assets. Westerners foolish enough to believe his fictions. He was bait dressed in the credibility of a supposed defector, and they bought it. Because Vogel wasn't just good at lying, he lived the lie. Every gesture, every word, every carefully rehearsed piece of intelligence. It was all theater, and he had turned it into an empire. The realization cut deeper than any ambush ever could. I hadn't just been fooled, I had been used to build his legend. My failure at Fulda wasn't a dead end. It was the foundation of his career, and I would be damned before I let that stand. So I moved on to step 2, infiltration. I needed access, not to the Stasi directly. That would have been suicide, but to the circles around Vogel, his couriers, his protectors, his associates. I spent weeks in Berlin living like a ghost. I shadowed his drivers, memorized their routes. I watched the cafes where his men met, the apartments where his couriers stayed. I learned their habits, their tells, their weaknesses. One courier, a young man named Richter, became my focus. Vogel trusted him. Too much. I watched Richter drink himself senseless night after night. I followed him into alleyways where he whispered secrets to mistresses. A man like that was a liability. So I made him mine. A threat here, a bribe there. The pistol never left my coat, but it didn't need to. Fear did the work for me. Within a week, Richter was my pipeline. Every message he carried, I intercepted. Every document, I photographed. Through him, I bled Vogel's world dry. and what I found chilled me to the bone. Vogel wasn't just playing the East against the West. He was orchestrating operations designed to cost lives. False coordinates slipped into NATO channels, ambushes prepared with information he had tailored. Dozens dead because commanders trusted the words of a man who had once walked into our lines with trembling hands. I had thought my platoon was the only casualty of his deception. I was wrong. We were just the beginning, and with every revelation my obsession grew darker. I stopped sleeping. I stopped eating. Nights blurred into days, days into nights. My walls were covered in notes, maps, photographs. A web of red strings that all converged on one face, Vogel's. But obsession makes you reckless. And one night, in a dingy hotel near Friedrichstrasse, I heard the unmistakable sound of boots in the hallway. Not the careless shuffle of travelers, the measured rhythm of men trained to move as one. I reached for my pistol, heart pounding. They had found me. The boots stopped outside my door. For a moment the world narrowed to the sound of my own breathing. The pistol was cold in my palm, safety off, barrel aimed at the knob. If they came in, it would be close, quick, ugly. But the door didn't splinter. It clicked, slowly, quietly. Professional. 3 shadows slipped inside. Stasi. I didn't need uniforms to know. The discipline in their posture gave them away. Predators moving through their kill zone. The first man crossed toward the window, backlit by the Berlin street lamps. The second circled toward the bathroom. The third lingered near the door, a silencer screwed tight on his pistol. They thought they were the hunters. But I had been hunted before. The first man never saw me rise from the chair. My shot cracked like thunder in that cramped room, tearing through his chest before he could breathe. The second spun, muzzle flashing. I dropped behind the bed, plaster shattering above me. My return fire found his throat. The third dove for cover, but not fast enough. My bullet split his silence forever. And then, stillness. The kind of stillness that only comes after violence. I stood there, chest heaving, ears ringing, staring at 3 men who hadn't expected resistance. Not from me, not here. But I knew better than to celebrate. If the Stasi had sent a team, more would follow. I tore through their pockets, searching for identification, orders, anything. One of them carried a folder, my name scrawled across the front. Inside, photographs, surveillance shots, notes on my movements. They had been watching me for weeks, and there it was. A single line underlined in red. Asset Orpheus requests his removal. Orpheus, Vogel's code name. The man I had once trusted had marked me for death. I burned the folder in the bathroom sink, smoke curling toward the ceiling. My time in Berlin was finished. If I stayed, I would end up like the men on the floor, nameless, disposable, forgotten. But flight wasn't an option. Not yet. Not while Vogel still breathed. So I changed tactics. No more shadows, no more waiting. If Vogel wanted me gone, then I would put myself in his path. For weeks I baited him. I leaked whispers through Richter, hints that I carried proof of his double game. Documents, names, evidence that could ruin him in the eyes of both East and West. Bait he couldn't resist, and he bit. A meeting was arranged. Neutral ground, they said. An abandoned train station on the outskirts of Leipzig. Midnight. I knew it was a trap. So did he. But some traps are worth walking into if it means you finally see the face of your enemy. The station was a skeleton of the war. Shattered glass, crumbling walls, rusted tracks leading nowhere. My boots echoed as I stepped inside, pistol steady, every sense straining. He was there. For the first time since Fulda, I looked into the eyes of Dieter Vogel. He hadn't aged the way I had. No gray in his hair, no weight on his shoulders. He looked stronger, sharper, as if betrayal had preserved him. His coat was immaculate, his boots polished. And behind him 6 guards waited in the shadows. But his smile was what froze me. Not smug, not cruel, almost warm. "Captain Halverson," he said, his voice smooth as glass. "I wondered how long it would take you." Hearing his voice again was like a blade twisting in an old wound. "You sold me a lie," I said, my finger tightening on the trigger. "And good men died for it." Vogel tilted his head as if I were a student who'd misunderstood the lesson. "No, Captain, I sold everyone a lie. That was the point. and men will keep dying for it long after you and I are dust. The guards shifted, hands brushing weapons. But Vogel raised a single hand and they froze. His eyes stayed locked on mine. You came here for truth, he said. So let me give you some. You think you're chasing justice, but you're not. You're chasing absolution, and you'll never find it at the end of a gun. My hands shook, not from fear, from rage, from the unbearable calm in his voice. I wanted to end him, right there, right then. But Vogel wasn't finished. He stepped closer, boots scraping on broken stone. Pull that trigger, Captain, and you'll give me immortality. I'll become the martyr you failed to stop. Or you can walk away and live with the knowledge that the lie I built will outlive you. His smile widened. Either way, I win. The air inside that broken station felt heavier than the jungle in monsoon season. Every breath scraped against my lungs. Vogel's words echoed, not just in the room, but in the hollow I carried inside me. You're chasing absolution. He was right, and that truth sickened me more than the lie he'd spun. I steadied my pistol, but my finger froze on the trigger. Behind him, his guards shifted, impatient. Their weapons gleamed under the fractured moonlight. 6 rifles against my 1. If I fired, they'd cut me down before Vogel's body hit the floor. Maybe that was what he wanted, a clean ending. My corpse beside his, a perfect story for the propaganda machine. But stories are weapons, and I wasn't about to hand him mine. Tell me something, I said, my voice low, steady. When you walked into Fulda that night, when you sold us your story, was any of it real? Vogel's smile thinned, his eyes hardened. All of it, he said. Every word, every tear, every detail, real. Because I made it real, that's the trick, Captain. A lie only works if the liar believes it himself. The admission hit harder than any bullet. He wasn't confessing, he was boasting. And for the first time I understood. Vogel wasn't a man serving a system. He was serving himself. East, west, truth, lies. They were just tools. He was the craftsman, and I was his masterpiece. Rage welled up, hot and dangerous. My arm trembled. The urge to end him surged like fire through my veins. But then I saw Jenkins's face, Miller's, Vargas's, the men who had paid the price for my arrogance at Fulda. If I pulled the trigger now, their deaths would be folded into Vogel's legend. I would give him the very immortality he craved. I lowered the pistol. The guards stiffened, but Vogel only laughed, soft, almost genuine. There it is, he said, the restraint that always kept you beneath me. You'll never be more than a shadow, Halverson. A ghost chasing ghosts. He turned, signaling his men. For a moment I thought they'd execute me right there, but instead they parted, giving me a path to the door. Go, Vogel said, his back to me. Carry your guilt, tell your stories. In the end, no one will believe you anyway. His arrogance was a blade, sharp and precise, but blades cut both ways. I holstered my pistol and walked past him. Every step felt like surrender, but I knew better. This wasn't the end. It was the beginning of a war not fought with bullets, but with truth. Outside, the night air hit me like a baptism. Cold, brutal, cleansing. I disappeared into the ruins of Leipzig, every instinct screaming at me to vanish, to hide, to survive. But inside, something had shifted. I wasn't chasing absolution anymore. I was carrying testimony. Vogel thought lies were immortal, but the truth, spoken, recorded, remembered, could be just as enduring. Over the years, I gathered evidence, documents smuggled through Richter's trembling hands, tapes whispered out of Berlin's safe houses, names, dates, betrayals, a record that tied Vogel not to heroism but to orchestrated death. And I told the story again and again to anyone who would listen, to officials who dismissed me, to allies who doubted me, to young recruits who needed to understand what arrogance and deceit could do. I never saw Vogel again. He vanished into the labyrinth of East Germany, swallowed by the very lies he had built. But his ghost followed me. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that smile, that calm certainty that he had won. Maybe he had. Maybe he hadn't. But I survived. And survival in its own way is victory. Because as long as I draw breath, I can speak. And as long as I speak, his lie will never stand unchallenged. The years after Leipzig were not kind, but they were mine. I carried scars, not the kind you see, but the kind that live beneath the skin, the kind that wake you in the night, whispering questions you'll never answer. Vogel was a ghost by then. His name rarely surfaced, and when it did, it was wrapped in rumors. Some said he died in an internal purge. Others claimed he became a shadowy advisor, feeding disinformation until the wall fell. Me, I think he simply melted into the cracks, as all liars do when the light gets too close. But his lie lived on. I saw it in the mistrust between allies, in the failed operations, in the caskets draped with flags. A ripple that never stopped moving outward, and still I spoke. Recruits asked why my voice trembled when I taught them about counterintelligence. Young men leaned closer when I told them about the weight of arrogance. Some believed me, some didn't. That's the curse of truth. It rarely arrives dressed as convincingly as a lie. But I kept speaking, because silence would have meant Vogel had won. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd pulled the trigger that night in Leipzig. Maybe his myth would have ended with him, or maybe it would have grown stronger. The martyrdom he secretly desired. That's the cruel trick of choices. You never know the ending you avoided, only the one you chose. I chose survival. I chose memory. I chose to live with the burden and tell the story so that others would understand. A single lie believed at the right time can kill more than any bullet. My name is Captain Richard Halverson. Once I was a soldier. Once I was a man who believed he could see through deception. And once I learned how wrong I was. But I am still here. And as long as I draw breath, I will remind you. The battlefield isn't always marked with trenches and tanks. Sometimes it's fought in whispers, in shadows, in promises too good to question. And the deadliest weapon in war is a lie. If you've walked this far with me, then you've carried the weight of this story too. And maybe in some small way that makes the burden lighter. Thank you for listening, and if you want to hear more stories like this one, stories of survival, betrayal, sacrifice, and the ghosts we carry home, then stay with me here in the war chair, because the stories don't end when the war does. They live on, in voices like mine, and now, in ears like yours.